I've been very fortunate just in the last few years. I worked with Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs, and so I've been able to get a bit of an insight into how he thought about the BRIC idea, how he thought about which other countries could follow that similar transition. And if we think about the economic world, clearly that has changed materially even in the last 10, 15, 20 years. If you think about how quickly places like China have industrialized, that only took 30 years, when in the West it took us 150, sometimes 200 years. And so that industrialization has put us at a point now where, if we think about it on a PPP adjusted basis, the emerging market world represents half of our global economy. In the same context, you think about the corporate environment, you now have a third of the world's billionaires living in the emerging market world. You have 25, 30% of the world's Fortune 500 companies coming from this developing world. So it's critically important to what's going on today. The key importance here is that transition has not stopped. We are still in an environment where a lot of these developing worlds are going to be at the forefront of the positive momentum we see in the global economy. If we think about the decade we're in, we're likely to see 70, 75% of all of the growth we see this decade coming from the developing world. We're likely to see 2 billion people move into that middle class, so be lifted out of poverty and actually become real consumers. And in that context, you're going to see an additional $15, $16 trillion of real consumption coming into the marketplace. Now, that has material implications not only for those individual countries, but also for the world as a whole, for us sitting in the UK, how we interact with some of those places, how we trade with some of those places. Clearly, the BRICS have been the flag bearer for what has happened so far. They've really pulled the emerging market world into prominence in the 2000s. A lot of the tailwinds that drove that story have started to abate, but we're starting to see other places really come to fruition. One of the ones that's very close to my heart, I find very interesting, is Nigeria. A lot of people will think about Nigeria and they'll put it in the context of what they hear in Western media about Boko Haram, about what's going on in terms of corruption and the challenges that exist there. But actually, from an economic perspective, you've got 175, 180 million people. You've got an economy that actually is now the largest economy in Africa. They rebased their GDP but a couple of months ago, and actually they are now the largest economy in all of Africa. And when we think about it from an investment opportunity, that emergence of a new consumer, that rapid growth story that you're seeing domestically in Nigeria is something that is massively underappreciated. One of the very simple stories we've seen in the last few years is a company that makes stock cubes, so bouillon cubes. You put it in soup, stew, it gives some flavor. We don't really think about the implications of that in the Western world because it's freely available. It's very cheap. It's something you have in the back of the cupboard. You forget about it. You pretend you can cook once a month. You get it out. Then you forget you can cook again and you put it back. Somewhere like Nigeria, that's hugely aspirational. Even at 5 or 10 cents a piece, that's not something you can really afford when you live on less than $1 a day. And as I said, a lot of people from an investment context will think about Nigeria and paint it with the brush of all the challenges that exist there. But something as simple as a stock cube, which costs 5 or 10 cents a piece, won't get them excited. It's when you put it in the context of how big that opportunity is. You've got 175 million people. You've got people crossing that middle class threshold very, very rapidly. And what that means is they sell 50 million of those stock cubes every single day in Nigeria. They sell 100 million of them across sub-Saharan Africa every single day. And so the magnitude of that opportunity is starting to be seen in places other than just your BRIC countries. And so when you think about how that impacts us in the Western world, well, now we're at a point where over a third, close to 40% of all of the exports we have from the developed world go into the emerging world. So that is critically impacting the businesses we see around us. If you think about developed market companies again, well, they are selling roughly 30% of all their sales come from the emerging market world. It is something that has to be acknowledged. It's something that will be a very critical driving force of the coming decades. But it's also very important to understand what's going on domestically within some of these emerging market countries. You're actually now seeing the emergence of globally competitive brands out of the emerging market world. If you go back even 20 years, global revenues that came from the emerging market companies was less than 5%, maybe 3 or 4% of all your listed revenues came from the EM world. That now sits at over 20%. So a fifth of the world's sales are coming from companies based in the emerging market countries. That is very critical. That will continue to increase as we go forwards. I think the other very important implication is how these countries are starting to evolve as you get a little bit more industrialized. The way in which China grew in the 2000s, in the 1990s, was to be the manufacturing base for the Western world, that competitive labor force that allowed Western corporates to put manufacturing bases in China and then ship all their products back to the Western consumer has started to evolve. China has seen material increases in wage rates. It's changed its focus to want to move up the value chain. And what that's actually doing is giving opportunities to other earlier stage emerging market countries. And if you look at light manufacturing exports, actually places like Bangladesh, places like Vietnam, Philippines, these are the countries that are actually starting to grasp that opportunity in a very similar way to China did in the 1990s. So really starting that growth cycle, starting to be the export manufacturer for the Western world. And as that happens, as you lift people out of poverty, so you get the evolution of that underlying domestic economy. So I think just in very simple conclusion, we have seen some of this transition take place already. The BRICS have been the flag bearers for that transition. That will not stop. You will continue to see the emerging market world drive a lot of the positive momentum we see in the global economy, but it's important to look beyond just those BRIC countries and try and decide which other countries have the same demographic power to really be major global powers.